Good evening, folks, and welcome to another special episode of Beer Rating with Sean Connors. As you can see, the beer I got this week is Faxe Premium. I actually have, I'm not sure if you can see it, I'll just zoom in for a second. I got a specialty mug from the Faxe Brewery itself. Now this beer is actually a Danish beer. It's from a town in Denmark, Faxe. So the brewery is named after the town. I'll pour this little gem up in a rather huge mug. A lot of breweries have their own special mugs or special glasses. Wow, that's kind of pathetic. Let's see. Luckily I got a second one. Alright, that's a bit better. Quite a bit of head there, and that's actually my research. This beer is actually known to give a little substantial bit of head there. So we'll let that sit for a second. As you can see, it's kind of it's clear, but not super clear. A little bit of a haze to it, almost like a golden straw color. It's got a nice aroma to it. I'm just going to let that sit before I taste. I got a little bit left in there. Now the mug itself, it's as I said, this is it's premium lager. They call it all-malt lager. Basically, that means they use barely and no additives such as sugar or whatever. But the mug such as this is a typical what you might consider a mug that you might see at an Oktoberfest or something like that. Normally with the beer festivals, you know, there's a lot of cheering and clinking of glasses. So because of that, you don't want a really a type of glass or mug that's going to break easily. So something like this, I mean, you could cling this all day long. And plus, if you're at Oktoberfest or a beer festival, something like that, you don't want to be going back and getting refills every couple of minutes. You got something like this, you're looking at almost a liter of beer. Actually, this beer itself, it comes in a 1 liter can. I haven't seen it here locally, but from the website, it's a big seller in Germany, the 1 liter. Not surprising. So I'm going to give it a taste. It's not bad. As I said, it's an all-malt lager. And as we talked about previously, you know, beer is broken down into ales or lagers. And Pilsner, which, you know, your Budweiser, your Coors, your Labatt's, they're all Pilsners, which is a type of lager. Now this, normally a beer will say which type of lager it is, whether it's a Bock, whether it's a Pilsner, whatever the case may be. This one, all it says is, it says quality lager beer. So it's almost like a Pilsner, but Pilsner are normally a little bit clearer, maybe a little bit spicier. So they label it just as a lager. It's not a bad beer. They label themselves from their website. They label it as a smooth, full-bodied, crisp, and well balanced. Obviously, you know, they're going to talk up their beer as much as they can, such as anybody would. But normally, crisp and smooth is typical for a lager. So it's not a bad beer. It's a heavy beer when you got a 1 liter jug of it. Alright, as I said, it's brewed in Denmark. It started off as a family brewery, but now it's actually owned by one of the bigger conglomerates. I'm not sure exactly which one. I think it might be InBev, which is one of the global leaders, but I'm not 100% sure. As I said, been around since 1901. They're known, as you can see on the can, they got the Viking on it. That's pretty well all their different beers. That's their logo, trademark, whatever you might want to call it. They actually have several different beers, and at one point they actually did soft drinks as well. I'm not sure if they still do. It got to the point at one point, this is back in their history of the brewery, they became such a success that their water supply, I guess municipal water or the local water, couldn't keep up with how much they needed. So they actually dug their own well, which they still use. And the well, there's a lot of limestone and coral, which actually acted as a filtration for the water, and also contained mineral salts, which added, I guess, flavor to their beer. And the alcohol content of this one, 5%. So it's, you know, your typical lager, more or less. I'm definitely enjoying it. Not quite sure how much yet, but it's definitely no less than a 3. No less than between 3 and 4.5. I'm not quite sure where yet, but interesting note though, this had a fair bit of head, as you've seen, and the head actually dissipated fairly quickly. You know, it's nice when the head kind of lasts. You can see a little bit of the head right here, and on my Facebook page I actually mentioned about lacing. That's a little bit of lacing right there. Basically, lacing is a sign of a good beer and a good clean beer glass. And if you see Guinness when you drink it, Guinness, you can actually see the foam as you drink it, the foam marks. So that's called lacing. Anyway, for the last couple of weeks, we've been talking about the 4 main components of beer, being your barley or malt or your grain, as well as your hops, your water, and your yeast. So we've looked at all the first 3. The only one we haven't looked at yet is yeast. So we're going to talk about that a little bit here today. So anybody from high school biology, you know, yeast is what they call a unicellular fungi. It's a living organisms, and yeast are pretty well everywhere in the environment. Wherever you're standing, there's yeast in the air. The thing with beer, basically it's a magical component of beer. It's what turns the wort, which is your sugary flavored water, into alcohol. So it's a driving force behind beer. The yeast converts the sugar into alcohol and CO2, your carbonation. It adds, you know, there's different types of yeast. There's lager yeast and ale yeast, which we call bottom and top fermenting. With ales, the yeast is known as top fermenting, lager's bottom fermenting. I think I talked about that in one of the first episodes. But even within that, there's many different varieties of yeast, and it's up to the brewmaster to decide which one he's going to use, whether it's a top or bottom, and then what he wants the yeast to do. Some yeast might be good for flavor, other ones, you know, maybe that give you a little bit more alcohol, whatever the case might be. So basically, once your wort is cooled, you got to add your yeast, and your wort's got to be cool, and you got to be really careful, because if it's not cooled properly, if it's too cold, it's not gonna, the yeast won't be able to work as much as it should be. If it's too hot, your wort's too hot, it's going to kill the yeast. So you got to make sure you get that perfect balance there. Now, so you add your yeast to your wort, and it starts to develop alcohol and CO2. How long you leave it depends on the brews. Most ales, you're looking at 2 to 3 weeks, where lagers, it could be anywhere from 6 weeks plus. And some are actually extended periods. You might have seen bottle conditioned beer, or you pick up a beer, it might say bottle conditioned. In that case, basically, the yeast is not filtered, or sorry, the brew is not filtered, so there's still yeast left when you bottle it, or you add a little bit of yeast, and it continues a fermentation in the bottle. So if you ever see bottle conditioned, that's what it actually means. And yeast itself, some breweries, they will reuse a yeast. So basically, they'll filter the beer, and they'll take some of the yeast, and they'll reuse it for the next brew. And that can be used anywhere from 7 to 10 times. If you remember there a while ago, we talked about the purity laws in Germany, which back in the 1500s, and basically said, you know, there's only certain ingredients you can use for beer. And actually, I think originally I said it was hops, water, what did I say? Oh, sorry, your grains, your water, your hops, and I said yeast. Originally, in 1516, yeast wasn't included. And the reason for that is science wasn't at the point yet where they understood that yeast was actually a product. At the time, basically, they would, you know, get your hops or your malt, turn it into malt, make the wort, add your hops, and then basically leave it. And the yeast would be in the air, as we already mentioned, and it would do its work without anybody actually knowing what the hell was going on. As far as they knew, it was just happening. They didn't know why. It was actually quite a few years later when they actually pinpointed that it was yeast doing the work, and then yeast was actually added as part of the purity laws. And even to this day, some breweries, they use what they call wild yeast. And basically, most breweries, actually, when it's fermenting, it's actually in an enclosed tank or an enclosed vat. If they're going to use wild yeast, and a lot of what they call Belgian Lamberts beers, a lot of sour beers, fruit beers, they still use wild yeast. So basically, the wort is cooled, and rather than adding yeast, it's just left in an open tank. And a lot of times, what they'll do, they'll actually open up the windows to the brewery overnight, and basically the spores, the yeast, and the air will land in the wort and do the job. And for years, that was just the way they did it, because they had no idea that yeast was doing anything. They didn't even know yeast existed. It was almost like some type of voodoo magic, whereby you'd make your malt, add your hops, and then leave it, and presto, next thing you had beer. So once they found out yeast, then they actually found out the different varieties and whatnot. But like I said, for years they had no idea. It was just pretty well some type of voodoo magic. And even to this day, some Belgian beer, they still do it. And I'm sure there's American versions of the different sours and lamberts and whatnot. And if you ever hear wild beer or wild yeast, that's basically what it is. It's just letting nature control the yeast. There you go. Now back to this little number. It's got a bit of it's much like, one of your Pilsners with a little bit oof to it. So it's not a bad beer. It's definitely would want another. So for my rating for this one, I think I'm going to give it a 3.5. It's a good beer. It's nothing, outstanding by any means. It's a lager, it's a Pilsner, it's a thirst quencher. I'm almost leaning towards a 4. I'm tempted to say 3.5, but lately, or since I started this, I've been going either even numbers or half numbers, so I don't want to get into anything other than that. So I think I'm going to stick with a 3.5 with a strong 3.5. There you go. So that's it for this episode. As always, until next beer, enjoy responsibly. Cheers, folks.